Well, we just want to welcome everyone to part 2 of the Last Supper in the Gospel account. And this is a really interesting study, a follow-up to part 1. And of course, it's a presentation from Yah's Covenant Calendar. And the approximate date is Abib in the year of the crucifixion for our Yahushua HaMashiach. Another continuation of the Last Supper. In part 1, the controversy was over the date. Was the Last Supper on Abib 13 or was it Abib 14? And we said it was Abib 13 and not the 14th. And we also discovered that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. It absolutely was not a Passover meal. Well, tonight in part 2, we're going to be looking at this controversy over the bread. Is the bread at this supper table leavened or unleavened? And which bread would represent Yahushua's body? We also have that question to look at. And yes, like I said, the question is, was the bread at the Last Supper leavened or unleavened? Or was there both kinds of bread at that Last Supper table? And we're going to be looking at 3 witnesses. We will look at Luke on the Emmaus account. Luke is basically the only writer that has given so many details about the Emmaus account. And then we're going to look at John in a very special way because he talks about the second seating at the supper table. And we're also going to look at number 3 for patterns. That would be between type and antitype. We'll explain that a little bit. But first, we're going to take a very thorough examination of the Greek word bread. And Tim is going to be helping with our sunshine slides. So Tim, how about just starting out with this controversy in part 2?
What controversy? What is the controversy? Part 2. A question for us here. Can the type of bread used at the Last Supper be the item that will settle the controversy of whether or not the Last Supper was on Abib 13? Or if indeed the Last Supper was eaten on Passover, Abib 14? And what about these arguments? Number 1, if the bread was leavened, then the meal cannot qualify for the Passover meal eaten on Abib 14, where it is commanded to eat unleavened bread. And the second thinking, if the bread is leavened, then the last possible date for the Last Supper would have to be Abib 13. What if there's another option to be considered that we don't really know about? That's what we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to explore in this study.
Yes, and it's a very detailed study, but it's a fun study. So the first thing that we're going to look at is bread in Hebrew and in Greek. And we have learned that we need to look at some of these definitions to unravel some of these puzzles. The Hebrew word for bread is lechem. It's Strong's 3899. It's from 3898, basically food for man or beast. And then it says, especially bread, something made from grain. The King James Version will also use showbread. It'll use the word eat and food and fruit. And then there's that word loaf and meat and victuals. But loaf, when we think of loaf, we usually think of a raised loaf, something that is raised. It's puffy, okay? The Greek word for bread is artos when you look it up. And it is number 740 from G142. And bread is what it's going to say as raised or a loaf. And then it also, King James can use showbread or loaf, okay? So these definitions are going to come up quite a few times in the presentation. We won't be reading them all every single time, but they're just going to be there as a reminder, okay? Because these are 2 very important definitions. Now, there is a Greek word for unleavened. It's azumos. And if you look it up, it will say unleavened, G106, azumos from G1. And it does say unleavened, figuratively uncorrupted, and especially by implication for the Passover week And what it's talking about is actually the week of unleavened bread, the festival of unleavened bread. But I do want you to note something really important. In the Greek text, azumos is never used in conjunction with bread. It's only when identifying the festival of unleavened bread. That's the only time that you'll see azumos is being used in our Greek testaments today. The Hebrew portion of this study is really important because the New Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek for the Gentiles that could not read the Hebrew text. So it's really important to be looking at the Hebrew as well. Now, there are types of unleavened bread in the scriptures. They're not just one kind, but there are 3 different types of unleavened grain products. And one will be unleavened bread. You're familiar with that picture, and then unleavened wafers and unleavened cakes. But this study is going to address only the unleavened bread. If you go to bakeries at Passover time, you'll see all kinds of products that are unleavened that you can enjoy. Now, there are different qualities between leavened and unleavened bread. And the account given through Matthew, Mark, and Luke says, Yahusha broke bread. And you know, that detail should really not be overlooked. I know that he broke bread for, you know, the 4,000 and the 5,000 that he fed. But with the Last Supper, maybe we should just pay attention to Yahusha broke bread. I'm just using some logic and common sense here, not that it's going to be scriptural with a Hebrew definition or a Greek definition, but leavened bread is not broken. It has to be torn if you want to share it with others, if you're not going to cut it with a bread knife. You can, you know, bend it and whatnot, and yes, eventually it will be broken, but usually you tear it off. And on Sabbath, when we go out for dinner and there's a beautiful loaf of bread there, everybody just tears a piece off, okay? Unleavened bread or matzah, it isn't torn, it is broken. It'll snap in pieces. So for these 3 gospel passages, the context alone declares that Yahusha broke unleavened matzah bread to serve to all 12 of his disciples. But that's just kind of vague and watering. What about breaking bread? Like I said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahusha broke bread. And it's really interesting that John does not mention this detail. In fact, he talks about dipping sop. This is a deliberate action that includes only Judas, who happens to be sitting next to him. Well, was this a cultural courtesy? I found this really interesting from C. Tenney in the Expositor's Bible Commentary. He has this to say. Pay attention to what he has to say here. For the host, and that would be like Yahusha, to select such a tidbit from the main dish and give it to a guest, that would be a mark of courtesy and high esteem. I'm going to add in the word high there because it was a mark of courtesy and great esteem for that person. The disciples, seeing this, they would have concluded only that Yahusha was regarding Judas as a friend that he had confidence in. So when the disciples saw Yahusha dip this sop and give it to Judas, in their minds, they were thinking, wow, he gets high regard. You know, wish we were all sitting next door. But anyway, that's something that you want to remember about that dipping the sop. So Tim, what about dipping bread? What are there some other things that we need to learn?
Well, the qualities of unleavened bread and leavened bread differ when it comes to dipping. And further to that, John records, this bread was dipped good until sopping wet. When unleavened bread is totally immersed in wine, oil, or as sauce, it does not soak up or absorb too much of the dip. When leavened bread is totally immersed in wine, oil, or as sauce, it absorbs the dip very quickly and becomes sopping wet, as we would say. It sops it up quite readily, actually.
What do we know about this night?
Matthew, Mark, and Luke have clarity on two facts. Yahusha broke bread at the table of the Last Supper. There was a betrayer amidst the group. And the question is, how is the betrayer identified? I'm going to ask that one more time. How is the betrayer identified? There is more information that is of utmost importance for this study. We will, A, gather all the information, B, assemble the information in correct order, and C, we're going to form the conclusion from that information gathered and assembled. Leavened versus unleavened. In an attempt to determine whether the Last Supper was a Passover meal or not, many evangelicals today focus on the issue of whether the bread of the Last Supper was leavened or unleavened. Some say, if the bread was unleavened, then the Last Supper qualifies for the Passover meal. However, the opposite is also true. If the bread was leavened, then the Last Supper could not have been the Passover meal. Most equate the bread with the meal. So what about equating the bread with Yahusha? Will this give a different result? It's something for us to consider very seriously.
Mm-hmm. So we're just going to review these definitions from the Strong's one more time. Bread in Hebrew is lechem, okay, especially bread. And then you have that word loaf there. That definitely sounds like it's a raised loaf. And bread in Greek, the word that's used is artos. And don't forget that it's bread as raised or a loaf. So we're definitely getting the idea here that this is a raised loaf of bread in both Hebrew and in Greek. But I'd just like you to note that there is nothing in either of these definitions that indicates that the bread is always unleavened. In fact, both definitions seem to lean towards the leavened type of bread. So Hebrew is lechem, and in Greek, it's artos. But there is a serious question, because leaven seems to indicate sin most often. The question is, how can leavened bread represent our sinless Yahusha? We know he was without sin, even though he took all of our sins upon his body to bear them on the tree. So there are some things that we need to remember for this study. Because the Greek and the Hebrew definitions seem so very vague, there cannot be absolute clarity through that single option of just looking at the definitions. We're going to have to do a deeper study of Scripture in order to determine the answer to our question. So these are the things that we're going to be remembering as we go through this study. We need to remember grammatical context of passages. Context is really important. We need to remember scriptural patterns for the terms leavened and unleavened, and how these terms would link to these other terms of type, which is like a shadow picture, and antitype, which is a picture of something that is true, such as this. Leaven in the scriptures most often represents sin, most often. But leaven also represents the change and the growth necessary so that we can be fit for the kingdom of heaven. And unleavening is representing the ridding oneself of sin. So those are things that you will find in the scriptures. Next, we're going to do an examination of 5 different sections that are going to apply these scriptural definitions, the grammatical content and the context, and also the patterns. So I'm just going to give you an introduction here on what you're going to find in this study. This part of the study is going to compare Hebrew and Greek, the definitions for the English word bread, and we're going to attempt to determine whether the bread at this Last Supper is leavened or unleavened or both for the following categories. We want to try to figure this out if we can. What about the manna, leavened or unleavened? And those numbers 18 to 22 are the slide numbers that will be covering this. The sanctuary showbread, that's an interesting one. Was that leavened or unleavened? We're going to look at the consecration bread for the Aaronic priesthood. What about it? Was it leavened or unleavened? And also the loaves of Pentecost. We want to check those out. And then the breaking of bread in the account of the Emmaus walk on that wave sheaf day. What kind of bread was that? So this search should provide a foundation for the type of bread used at the Last Supper. At least that's what we're hoping. And then we should be ready to examine the gospel account and see if we can't figure out what kind of bread was used for the Last Supper. And that's going to be basically the last half of the study. So the first half is just going to be a workup to see if it will give us some information for the last half. Okay, let's start with the manna, this bread from heaven. The following information is based on a reasonable assumption that the manna given in the wilderness for 40 years was not leavened. So sometimes you have to make a reasonable assumption. You have to start asking questions. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a reasonable assumption that the manna was unleavened. Well, this bread definitely represented the Messiah that was to come. And we all know that his life would not be leavened with any sin of his own. And we all know that we are to partake of his perfect life. Therefore, it just seems reasonable to assume, okay, that the manna was completely unleavened. But the question is, can that assumption really be a final answer? Can we really just make an assumption like that and say, yeah, it sounds good to me? Well, let's read a little bit about the manna as bread in the Old Testament and see what it has to tell us, see if we can glean anything from that. Tim?
Exodus 16, verse 4. Then said Yahuwah unto Moshe, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. Verse 15. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, It is manna. For they wist not what it was. And Moshe said unto them, This is the bread which Yahuwah has given you to eat. And the name of that bread was lechem. Manna is H4478. Now, literally a whatness, so to speak. Manna, so called from the question about it. The Hebrew definitions for H3899 bread and H4478 for manna do not specify if the manna is leavened or unleavened. However, we know ordinary bread is leavened.
Mm-hmm. So at the end of each of these sections, we will do a little summary, just see what we came up with. So we're ready to do this Hebrew summary for the manna. The Hebrew does not give absolute clarity if the manna was unleavened. There is nothing there. But scriptural patterns may give us some clarity using type and antitype comparisons. Well, if the manna as the type represents Yahusha as the antitype or as the bread of life, having no sin of his own, could we therefore say, the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype seems to link to the unleavened concept? Could we do that? Could we use that pattern? This pattern shows for the reasonable assumption, or it allows for the reasonable assumption, that the manna was unleavened. So we can make a reasonable assumption, and that's about as far as we can go for the manna. Well, Tim, what about manna as bread in the New Testament? What does it say there?
John 6, verse 31. Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. manna, G3131. It's of a Hebrew origin, and the definition is an edible gum. In John 6, the Greek word for bread, which is artos, is used when referring to manna from heaven as the lechem, bread. Here the manna is definitely compared to a leavened type of bread using the Greek. The comparison of manna to H3899, lechem, was not that specific as the Greek word artos was for leavened bread. We need to remember, there is no Greek term for unleavened bread, only for the feast of unleavened bread.
That's important too. So we're ready to do our summary for this Greek manna. Again, the Greek appears to give absolute clarity that the manna was leavened. So we're back to these scriptural patterns for type and antitype. In the New Testament, would it be different for type and antitype in the New Testament than it is in the Old Testament? I don't think so. It wouldn't change. The concept of leavened manna seems to break down here, at least it does for us. So it appears that the pattern has been severely disrupted. Under this premise, is it safe to assume the manna was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the type and antitype comparisons that you'll find in the Old Testament? I just would like you to also note that the New Testament, remember, it's a translation of the Hebrew into Greek. And in many cases, the Greek translation fails to give the full Hebrew concept. You'll find that quite a few times too. Okay, we're all done with the manna. Let's start with our second section on the showbread. And I hope you find this really interesting. The 12 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary also represent the Messiah as the bread of life. And what does that mean of the showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary? Continuously in the presence of the Father. Well, that week-old bread was replaced on Sabbath with freshly baked loaves on the Sabbath day. So to us, it seems that the showbread would have to be unleavened, or it would probably spoil before it was eaten a week later by the priests in the holy place. But then, on the other hand, the presence of the Father can easily preserve leavened bread in the holy place, just like that pot of manna was preserved for decades inside the Ark of the Covenant. So do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? And we just want to make a note here that showbread is made up of a combination of two words, the word show and bread. So when we look at the definitions, there'll be two types of definitions. Before we go on to that, I just want to pose the question, do you think that the showbread looked like this? Or was it really just 12 flat matzah to provide food for the full course of the priests each week? That's just something to think about. So Tim, tell us about some scriptures in the Old Testament that talk about showbread.
Well, let's look at Exodus 35:13. The table and his staves and all the vessels and the showbread. That's lechem. The presence is H6440 and lechem is H3899. Showbread, H6440, panim, the face as the part that turns, and showbread, H3899, lechem, especially bread or grain made into a loaf, possibly. An example, the showbread faces the presence of the Kodesh one in the sanctuary, also known as the bread of the presence. As with the manna, the showbread links back to the same Hebrew word, H3899, lechem, which can indicate either leavened or unleavened bread. Soon it will be shown that lechem as a general term for any kind of bread has to be qualified with the specific term unleavened, which is H4682, matzah, to actually be unleavened bread.
And the important word that was just read was qualified. Very important word. We're going to see that pop up again. So we're ready to do our summary for the Hebrew showbread. Again, number one, the Hebrew does not give absolute clarity that this showbread had to be unleavened. And when we look at the scriptural patterns, well, they can give us some clarity using type and antitype comparisons. As with the manna, the showbread type represents Yahusha as the antitype, and he's as that bread of life, having no sin of his own, but being continuously in the presence of the Father. Therefore, if you look at the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype, well, it seems to link really strongly to the concept of unleavened showbread. This pattern can allow for a reasonable assumption that the showbread was unleavened, even though the definition for lechem leans towards leavened bread. And we're going to see if this actually is going to hold up or not. But next, we're going to look at showbread in the New Testament and see if we find anything new.
Hebrews speaks of the sanctuary showbread as seen in Exodus. As with the manna, the showbread also links to G740, artos, indicating either leavened or unleavened bread. Even though artos can be leavened bread, this does not mean the sanctuary showbread had to be leavened bread. There will be two Greek definitions. Let's look at Hebrews 9, verse 2. For there was a tabernacle made, the first, wherein was the candlestick and the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. Here, showbread is G4286, prosthesis, from G4388, a setting forth, specifically the showbread in the temple, as exposed before Yahuwah. Again, showbread, artos, as raised, or a loaf.
Yes, you're going to hear that definition a few more times in this study. So I just want to continue on with this showbread in the New Testament. Just as leaven can represent either the leaven of sin or leaven for the kingdom of heaven, so too the showbread, it could have represented the varied spiritual conditions of Israel. We know that many times in the Old Testament, Israel was in rebellion, completely leavened by the ways of the surrounding pagan nations. Any bread or meal offerings that attended the blood sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering had to be unleavened, any of them and all of them. However, the showbread, it was never ever offered on the altar of burnt offering. It was always eaten by the priests in a holy place. So we need to be aware of comparisons that use the example of unleavened grain offerings upon the altar of burnt offering as a dictated rule that the showbread has to always be unleavened. We really can't do that because the showbread was not put on the altar. This would be an acceptable rule if showbread was offered on the altar of burnt offering. I'd just like you to note that the grain offerings were always in the courtyard and the showbread was always contained in the holy place. But there is a question to ponder. Could this showbread also represent two different mandates of Yahusha, not just Israel? There's something to think about there as well. Well, let's look at Greek showbread summary to see what we can find out. We're going to go through these same points that we've been doing all along. The Greek appears to give absolute clarity of leavened showbread, just like it did with the manna. So again, would we have to look at those scriptural patterns for type and antitype in the New Testament? Are they going to be different than what you would find in the Old Testament? You know, the concept of leavened showbread seems to break down here if we hold to the idea that showbread was always unleavened, because it represents the sinless life of Yahusha. There's some things that are just going to break down. It appears, and I'm using that word on purpose, it appears that the pattern has been severely disrupted. Under this premise, it is safe to assume, I'm going to ask the question, is it safe to assume that the showbread was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the Hebrew definitions? Same thing that we found with the manna. Does the Greek take precedence over the Hebrew? So far, there just doesn't seem to be too much of a specific scriptural guideline for the showbread. And you know what? It is quite possible and logical that the showbread was either leavened or unleavened, as we can understand from a further study. But now we want to look at the consecration bread for the priesthood, because that's a little bit different. Tim, can you help us out?
In Exodus 29 and Leviticus 8, Moshe was divinely directed to transfer his priestly duties to Aharon and his sons under the Aharonic priesthood. Part of the ceremony included the use of 3 different types of unleavened bread called unleavened bread, unleavened cakes, and unleavened wafers. Anything to do with being unleavened is matzah. Exodus 29, verse 2. And unleavened bread and cakes, unleavened tempered with oil, and wafers, unleavened anointed with oil, of wheaten flour shalt thou make them. Notice that wheat, it's not barley, only the best is for our Savior. Exodus 29, verse 23. And 1 loaf of bread, and 1 cake of oiled bread, and 1 wafer out of the basket of the unleavened bread, that is before Yahuwah. And thou shalt put all in the hands of Aharon and in the hands of his sons, and shalt wave them for a wave offering before Yahuwah. And thou shalt receive them of their hands, and burn them upon the altar for a burnt offering, for a sweet savor before Yahuwah.
Let's look at the consecration bread in the Old Testament. Only the Old Testament this time. It is not mentioned in the New Testament. And guess what? It is always unleavened bread every single time. Unleavened, H4682, matzah, okay, in the sense of greedily devouring for sweetness. Properly, it is sweetness. If it doesn't have that sweetness, concretely or sweet, not soured or bittered with yeast, specifically an unfermented cake or loaf. They're saying for the festival of Passover, because there was no leaven used then. So King James will use unleavened bread, unleavened cake, and it means without leaven. Okay, so bread we already know is lechem. We've been through that definition there for a couple of times already. So just a little note on this consecration bread. All of the following were unleavened, or you could say were matzah, and all 3 types of unleavened product were in one basket, and it was called a basket of unleavened bread. Of course, the bread, $38.99, is lechem, especially bread. Then there was the cakes, 2471 challah, or a cake. And then there is wafers. Rakik, I think is how you say it, just a thin cake or a wafer. And all of those were put into a basket of unleavened bread. All 3 grain products for the consecration of the priests are noted again as $38.99 lechem. The Hebrew definition, it seems to indicate none of the green items were unleavened unless qualified. Have to be qualified by that term unleavened, 4682 matzah. So that term matzah, unleavened, has to be there. Subsequently, every reference to manna, bread, cakes, wafers, or showbread cannot be understood as unleavened if 4682 matzah is absent. There is no New Testament counterpart for the use of unleavened bread, unleavened cakes, and unleavened wafers for the consecration of priests in an earthly sanctuary priesthood. And we all know that Yahushua is now our high priest of the Melchizedek order, and his sinless life leads directly to and fulfills unleavened item, be it grain or drink offerings. We'd just like to go through a Hebrew summary for this consecration bread, because in this case, the Hebrew gives absolute clarity that the consecration bread, the cakes and the wafers were unleavened, and they were taken from that basket of unleavened bread. These unleavened grain items were waved heavenward before being laid on the altar of burnt offering. And I'd just like you to note here that leaven of any sort was never, ever placed on this altar. These scriptural patterns do give clarity when we look at the type and the antitype comparisons. As with the manna and the showbread, the unleavened consecration breads, which is the type, once again represent Yahusha as the antitype and he as the bread of life. Having no sin of his own, he had a perfect life. His life was laid on the altar at that stake as an offering of a sweet savor to the Father. And definitely the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype links very strongly to the concept of unleavened consecrated breads. So there is no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of unleavened 4682 matzah. So in this case, there's no assumptions that are necessary whatsoever. So we're finished with part 3, and we're now ready to go on to part 4. And this is the loaves of Pentecost. I would just like you to notice that the Hebrew word for loaves is also 3899 lechem, just as it was with manna and the sanctuary showbread and the consecration bread. However, this time the lechem is leavened bread, and it's qualified with the word leaven. So there's not going to be any doubt whatsoever. In Leviticus 23:17, this is what it reads: "You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves," that's 3899 lechem, 2 wave loaves of 2/10 deals. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven. That's shemetz. They are the first fruits unto Yahuwah. Don't forget that review for bread, for lechem. Okay, it says like it's a raised loaf. So, but right here we have this word leaven, which is shemet, and it's talking about fermentation. And of course, you're going to have leavened bread, nicely raised loaf. So we have a qualification there. Definitely is qualified that these loaves for Pentecost are leavened. So we can go ahead with our summary for the Hebrew. As with the consecration bread, the Hebrew again gives absolute clarity that the Pentecost loaves were leavened. Yes, the 2 loaves of leavened bread were required, and they were presented as a thank offering being waved heavenward. The first fruit sheaves of the wheat had been consecrated in its natural state, and these Pentecost loaves were from the new harvest of wheat, reaped and threshed and ground to flour, leavened and salted, kneaded and baked. And guess what? All by human hands. Let's look at the scriptural patterns for the clarity that we're looking for by using type and antitype comparisons. In this case, the leavened type represents Yahusha as a great teacher. His life, mixed with the life of individuals, represents truth and spirit-filled people preaching the gospel for the kingdom of heaven. And it's only Yahusha's spirit-filled leaven that can change the sinner to reflect him. As with the consecration bread, there is no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of the word leaven, 52, or 2557, I mean, shemetz. So we don't have to make any assumptions whatsoever when it comes to that. Well, just a little bit of a Hebrew summary here as we continue on with these Pentecost loaves. Number one, so far the Hebrew has shown that 3899 lechem bread can be either leavened or unleavened. If the lechem is not qualified with the terms of 4682 matzah for unleavened bread, or it's qualified with shemetz for leavened bread, you cannot say with exact certainty what type of the lechem bread would be if you're just reading a verse. You have to look at all of these other things as well. At that point, everyone, you would have to carefully consider the scriptural patterns. You would have to look at type and antitype, or you would have to look at the context of a passage, which is exactly what we're going to do in the next section. But before we go into that, let's go back to the showbread and consider some other options. We just have a couple of questions about the showbread. This is a review. The consecrated loaves for the Aaronic priests were unleavened, being qualified by the term 4682 matzah. Okay, the consecrated loaves for the Aaronic priests were unleavened, and those cakes and whatnot were in the basket of unleavened bread. Number two, the Pentecost loaves were leavened, being qualified by that term 2557 of shemet. Definitely we had a qualification there. There was no way to misunderstand it. And those 12 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary, we know that they represent the Messiah as the bread of life, our Messiah as without any sin. But his life was also given for the leaven of the kingdom of heaven. And we know that he stands continuously in the presence of the Father for this purpose. So, question, do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? I have to say no, I have not found anything. And there is no qualifier for this showbread to be either leavened or unleavened. I have not found anything. But the question is, how would 12 flat matzah provide food for the full course of the priesthood for a complete week? How would that work? Would that be enough for them for the whole week? Well, we're just going to look at a little bit here about baking the showbread. This is something from the Temple Institute, and I think you're going to kind of enjoy what they have to say. Tim, can you help us out with this reading? With your mic on.
It was also discovered that each time the Hebrew word solet is used in Torah, it signified the method with which the flour was ground, specifically as fine flour. And I had mentioned that before, along with the wheat. It cannot be barley because barley does not grind to a fine flour. Since Torah forbids the use of yeast in the Holy Temple, notice what the article goes on to say, other leavening agents were necessary. 40 minutes is required for the kneading process. Does unleavened bread need this much kneading? The bread is baked in large ovens, 40 centimeters by 80 centimeters, with 8 centimeter thick walls. Gemara relates that a reoccurring miracle guaranteed that the showbread remained fresh for 1 week from the day it was baked, without the need for closed storage or refrigeration. Yet unleavened bread doesn't spoil like this. Professor Amar's recipe has succeeded in maintaining freshness for the duration of 1 week. The shape of the bread is achieved by using baking forms, as it was done in the Kodesh temple. 2 different shapes have been produced by Professor Amar: the konos shape, as depicted on ancient Chasmonian coins from the era of the Maccabees, and the shape known as tava prutza, the shape of an inverted Hebrew letter chet. So a question for us. Any requirements during Feast of Unleavened Bread?
Yeah, that's kind of a little bit interesting how they managed to get that recipe and have sort of some raised loaves, and it wasn't going to spoil, and all kinds of things that they were doing there. But we can just come up with some conclusions for the showbread here, I think. The research that has been completed thus far is that the sanctuary showbread could have been unleavened, or the sanctuary showbread could have been leavened, just depending on Yahusha's purpose. It could have been leavened or unleavened bread. And of course, that would have to be determined by the context, if you could find it. If that is so, I'd like you just to ponder another question here. What kind of bread would be placed in the holy place during the 7 days of the Unleavened Bread Festival, which will usually include some cycles from 2 weeks, not just 1 week? Do you think it would be raised bread? Do you think the showbread would be like a matzah? Or do you think that there would be provision for both? That's just a question to think about. What do you think was happening with the showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary during the week of the festival of unleavened bread? We can discuss that later. Okay, that finishes all those definitions that we needed to have so that we could do the last part of our study. And as I promised you, the first witness is going to be about Artos, the Artos bread study in the Gospel of Luke. And this is going to be the Emmaus account, and it will be found in Luke chapter 24. So it's going to be section number 5. Up to this point, there is no doubt that the Greek word for bread can be used to describe either leavened or unleavened bread. It's not every time you see it that it's just automatically leavened bread. It could be the other way too. In the account from Luke, we have to pay attention to the context, because that's going to be the determining factor for whether this bread was leavened or unleavened. And the 2 followers of Yahusha, they decided to return to Emmaus the same day that they heard that their master had risen. The events of this account occurred during the Passover festival. So I think what we should do is read the main verses before we start trying to chart the events. And we'll just have Tim help us do some reading here in Luke chapter 24.
Luke 24, the gospel account. Now, upon the first day of the week, that would be Abib 18, very early in the morning, they, that's the woman with spices, came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, and they entered in, and found not the body of Yahusha. He is not here, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again. And they remembered his words, and returned from the sepulchre, and told all these things, that he was risen, unto the 11, and to all the rest.
We're just going to continue on, but we're not reading the whole chapter. We're just going to select out a couple of verses that are important. We'll finish up on this slide.
Verse 13, and behold, 2 of them, these are followers included in the verse 9 group, they went the same day, that's Abib 18, to a village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 70 furlongs. This 7-mile walk from Jerusalem would take about 2 hours. And they talked together of all the things which had happened. And it came to pass that, while they communed together and reasoned, Yahusha himself drew near and went with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, that would be G740 Artos, and blessed it, and brake, and gave to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. And they told what things were done in the way, and how he was known of them in breaking of bread. At this point, Are you wondering about the use of artos as leavened bread here? Was it not in the festival of unleavened bread that this happened? How could he be breaking leavened bread?
That is a very good question. That's the exact question that we're asking about this account here. And I just have a little chart here for the first 5 days of Passover. Of course, we know that Yahusha died in the midst of the week, fourth cycle, which would be a Wednesday. That there is Abib 14, and that's day 1 of 8. The next day was the Feast of Unleavened Bread Sabbath, Abib 15. That would have been your 5th cycle, your 5th day. Then came the 6th day, the preparation day. That was the preparation before the weekly Sabbath. And that would have been Abib 16. Of course, following that is your weekly Sabbath, the 7th day Shabbat. And this was also a resurrection day. And that's day number 4 out of 8. And then the day after that is your First Fruits Festival and an Ascension. And number 2, this is where Yahusha is going to join the 2 travelers. It happens to be on this day of Abib 18. It's number 5 in 8. We're only going to show the first 5 days. But there are some facts for the Passover Spring Festival of the Emmaus account that we want to go through and just do a good review. Number 1, Abib 14 to 21 represents the 8 inclusive days for this festival. Okay, we're only charting the first 5, but there are 8 days in this Passover festival. Number 2, Abib 15 to Abib 21, that represents the 7 days of the festival or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And only unleavened bread, cake, or wafers are eaten during these days. This also includes Abib 18, the first cycle of the week as the Wave Sheaf Festival. Now, the women, the disciples, and others discover that their master is not in the tomb on Abib 18. And number 4, later on the same day in the evening, Yahusha meets up with the 2 disciples. They're walking to Emmaus, and he accepts their invitation to dine with them for the evening meal. They had to ask him 3 times before he actually said yes, that he would dine with them. That's kind of an interesting little story as well. Number 5, when Yahusha broke the bread, and it is artos in the Greek, that's when they recognized him, the way he broke the bread. Number 6, this artos bread was definitely not leavened bread, as Abib 18 is exactly the middle day of the week of unleavened bread. So unleavened bread starts here on Abib 15. It's 7 days long. So you have 1, 2, 3 days. And the Wave Sheaf was the exact midst of the festival week for the unleavened bread. And any Torah keeper and any follower of Yahusha would not be serving leavened bread to their guests during the week of unleavened bread. However, that Greek word artos for bread is right there in the New Testament, and we all know that it was defined as leavened bread. So what in the world happened here anyway? Did these 2 disciples of Yahusha really serve him leavened bread during the week of unleavened bread? That's the question. Number 7, we have already seen in previous examples that artos can have the dual meaning of leavened and or unleavened bread. In the Emmaus account, I'm pretty sure you all know that this artos bread was absolutely unleavened. There is no way that there was leaven found in that bread. So Tim is going to give us a summary for this Emmaus account that Luke has given us so many verses about. Tim?
Summary for Luke's Emmaus account. The Greek word for unleavened is G106 azumos, from G1 as a negative particle and G2219, unleavened, and figuratively uncorrupted. I'm sure many wonder why Luke's account for the unleavened bread eaten on Abib 18 was not linked to G106. The New Testament uses the word G106 azumos for unleavened, more in connection with the festival than with the type of bread. This is the reason for this to be examined next. So let's return to the fourth day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and examine things a little bit more closely.
And this is really an interesting slide. It has some interesting information on it. This Greek word for unleavened is azumos, okay? It's like matzah in the Hebrew. I have some points that I want you to pay attention to. On the fourth day of the feast or festival of unleavened bread, the bread being broken by Yehusha is azumo. There is very likely no leavened bread, artos, in the whole land of Israel for the entire 7-day feast of unleavened bread. You probably wouldn't find it. In Luke's account, the surviving Greek texts read artos, and that happens to be the common word for normal leavened bread. So this appears to be a simple oversight by those who copied or translated the original text. Point number 5, there are many variations of the New Testament writings where the very best Greek word was replaced with a very similar Greek word that was more in accord with the local language when the manuscript was copied. Now, back up to the title. What is Koine Greek? We will need to know what Koine Greek is. The Greek dialect aimed at the common people is called Koine. I think that's how you say it anyway. When there seems to be a conflict, as in this account with Luke, then the full and proper understanding has to be taken back to the Torah and back to the Hebrew definitions. These variations in the Greek text do not always degrade the text, but rather they help us to understand why it is important to choose the definition that fits the context and the content of every single verse when there seems to be a discrepancy. So sometimes we have to understand that they were using common words in the Greek that never really had the full understanding of what should have been put forward as a proper definition. So what is our summary here for Luke's Emmaus account? We're going to conclude it. Even though the Greek word for bread or artos holds that definition of leavened bread, the context of this passage is going to overrule that definition. I want you to remember that context is always king. Context will be above a definition. Any follower of Yehusha definitely would not be serving leavened bread on a day in the very midst of the 7-day feast or festival of unleavened bread. So you know what? We can be really thankful for Luke recording this event on the road to Emmaus. He has many, many verses when the other gospels might have 1 or 2. But you know what? This one testimony, it's the red flag that sets everything straight. Otherwise, everyone, it would be so easy to say the leavened bread represented Yehusha's flesh with our sins. But remember that our sins do not make his flesh sinful. No, not ever. Tim, will you do some conclusions for us regarding this bread in both Hebrew and Greek as we wind up this section?
The Hebrew word for bread, which is lechem, is used for both leavened and unleavened bread. The Greek word for bread, which is artos, also refers to both leavened and unleavened bread. Therefore, to understanding if bread is leavened or if it is unleavened, number 1, the Hebrew and Greek definitions cannot always stand alone. Number 2, the context must be given serious consideration. And number 3, scriptural patterns of type and antitype must be in full alignment. All 3 steps are important to find the true definition of a passage. And you've heard that saying, context is king. General summary for this section. We have seen several times where the Greek word for bread, which is artos, is used to identify both leavened and unleavened bread. This very same word, artos, is mentioned in the account of the Last Supper. So far, it has been shown that the Hebrew definition of the word lechem is not strictly unleavened bread unless it uses a qualifier combined with H4682, matzah. Likewise, lechem is not strictly leavened bread unless combined with H2557, chametz. In Greek, azumos is the best word to indicate unleavened bread if the text would not use Koine Greek. We will consider the verifying factor of type and antitype patterns after taking a careful look at the Last Supper in the four Gospels.
Well, we're finished with that section of Luke and the Emmaus account, and we're ready to look at the second witness about artos in the bread study. And this is going to be in John's Gospel. And he's going to talk to us about the second sitting at the table, at the supper table. And I kind of think this might be your favorite part. Well, Tim, will you help us out here?
Connecting the Emmaus testimony to the Last Supper. In Luke's Emmaus account, the Hebrew word for bread was not translated into the Greek as G106 azumos to indicate unleavened bread. The Greek used the word G740 artos that can take on either definition of leavened or unleavened bread. There was bread present at the Last Supper, but as to leavened or unleavened, this is not to be determined by observing only the Greek definitions used for bread. With a careful look at the account given in John, perhaps this questionable area will reveal another clear answer by again considering the context and scriptural patterns. And context is so important. Things to watch for in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record Yahusha breaking and blessing G740 artos bread, which appears to be leavened bread. John does not record Yahusha breaking or blessing artos bread. In fact, John doesn't record anything about the supper table where the bread and wine emblems were offered by Yahusha in remembrance of him. It is extremely important to note this stark omission by John. We need to remember this.
Mm-hmm. It is a stark omission. It is one that you need to pay attention to. But John has some other information. This first one is a reminder. John records nothing about the event where the bread and the wine were given to the disciples. Not one word. After supper was ended, Yahusha washed the feet of all 12 disciples, and then he returned to his place at that supper table and he sat down again. And only then does John record G740 artos bread, and only in connection with giving it to Judas, who accepts. This artos bread was not blessed and it was not broken by Yahusha. John does not record that Yahusha ate any of it, but merely the fact that Judas was going to accept this artos bread in his presence. And a few verses later, John connects this artos bread with the sop that was dipped in a very interesting way. Now, there's some questions that I want you to ponder first. I want you to think of these questions. Think about before, during, and after reading the four gospel accounts. We're going to be looking at all of the accounts. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, artos bread that Yahusha blessed and broke and gave to all representing his broken, perfect body, was this really leavened bread, as the Greek definition seems to suggest? Or was it unleavened bread, when you go according to scriptural patterns of type and antitype. Number 2, did Judas eat of this bread at the Last Supper ordinance? And number 3, we will compare the Synoptic Gospels to John. He shows that artos bread, also described as a sop, or just a morsel of bread, a small bite or a mouthful, that this sop was dipped by Yahusha. And guess what? Until it was soaking wet. And then it was given to Judas, and it was not blessed. Was this leavened bread, as the Greek definition suggests, or was it unleavened bread? And then you want to ask the question, where are the scriptural patterns for the context? And number 4, why didn't the other disciples get any of this dipped bread? Does John say anything about that? Let's look at a few more questions. After the foot washing, which disciples in the group were spiritually clean or spiritually unclean according to Yahusha's words? Number 6, in other words, which disciples would be considered unleavened from sin or leavened with sin, even though they had all taken part of the bread and the wine emblems? Number 7, remember those scriptural types and antitypes when Yahusha compares the bread and the wine emblems to himself? What kind of bread would he have used for this divine comparison? Remember, when it comes to the use of the Greek word G740 artos bread, context still has to be king. So we're now ready to examine the 4 Gospels. We're going to go through the verses that apply to the study tonight, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then we're going to look at John. Now, Matthew 26, verses 20 to 25, we're going to do those on this particular slide, but the whole passage of Matthew has 11 verses about what we're talking about. Verse 20, now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. Now, I'm just going to let this right column come up because I want to explain something about this right column. I will have the scriptures on the left side. On the right side, we are going to find these things come up with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yahusha sits down with 12 disciples. One of you will betray me. He's going to say that. You're going to find that it's recorded. Everybody asks, is it I? He's going to say, he who dips in the dish is the betrayer. And Judas asked if he was the betrayer. The answer is yes. And a question is, did Yahusha answer Judas in such a way as to expose Judas to the whole group? So these are the points that are going to come up with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And we're going to see if it's different with John. So let's read, starting with verse 21. And as they did eat, he said, verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and began every one of them to say unto him, Master, is it I? And he answered, and he said, he that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. The Son of Man goeth, as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Verse 25, then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? And he said unto him, thou hast said. Okay, let's continue reading. And as they were eating, Yahusha took bread, and he blessed it, and he brake it, and he gave it to his disciples, and said, take, eat. This is my body. I just have a question here with verse 26. Would Yahusha really use leavened bread to represent his body that had absolutely no leaven of sin? We've been asking that question all along. Verse 27, and he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and he gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. And I have a comment here with verses 27 to 29. Most understand that the grape juice in the cup was unfermented or unleavened to represent the blood of our sinless Messiah. Let's just remember that for a moment. Verse 28, For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in the kingdom of heaven. And then he goes on to say, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. Now, I'm just wondering if you happen to notice that in Matthew, there was no record of the foot washing. There was not one single thing said. So we've read the verses in Matthew. We're ready now to go ahead and read the verses in Mark and see if you can find anything different. Again, we have our points on the right-hand side. Verse 17, and in the evening he cometh with the 12. And as they sat and did eat, Yahushua said, Verily I say unto you, one of you which eateth with me shall betray me. And they began to be sorrowful and to say unto him one by one, Is it I? And another said, Is it I? And he answered and he said unto them, It is one of the 12 that dippeth with me in the dish. The Son of Man indeed goeth as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it for him that if that man had not been born. So we see that we've got similar things happening on that right-hand column. And as we continue with Mark, we're going to read, he has 10 verses, not 11 like in Matthew. So we're just going to finish up these verses. Verse 22, and as they did eat, Yahushua took bread, and he blessed, and he brake it, and he gave it to them. And he said, Take, eat, this is my body. Question, what kind of bread would really represent the unleavened, sinless body of Yahushua? Verse 23, and he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank. And again, what kind of drink would represent his unleavened body? Verse 24, and he said unto them, This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. Verily I say unto you, I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day that I drink it new in the kingdom of Yahuwah. And when they had sung a song, a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. And again, in Mark, there is absolutely no record of the foot washing, not a peep. Okay, so let's look at Luke. Luke has 10 verses as well, just like Mark did. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles were with him. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Remember, we talked about that phrase, with desire I have desired, back there in part 1, to understand that he really wanted to be there to eat with them on the next day with the Passover. For I say unto you, I will not eat any more thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. And he took the cup, and he gave thanks, and said, Take this, and divide it among yourselves. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Elohim shall come. Now, I just kind of found it interesting that Luke records the drinking of the cup and how it's divided before he talks about the rest of it. So he talks about the cup first, which is a little bit interesting. In verse 19, and he took bread, it's artos, and he gave thanks, and he brake it, and he gave it unto them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Same questions here for the bread and the wine. Do you think it's leavened or unleavened for our Savior? Likewise also the cup, after saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goeth as it was determined, but woe unto that man by whom he is betrayed. And they began to inquire among themselves which of them it was that should do this thing. Remember, everybody's asking, Is it I? Is it I? And again, Luke doesn't have a single thing to say about the foot washing, not a single thing. But he does have that phrase, with desire I have desired. That's interesting in Luke. Okay, we are ready to look at John 13. And do you notice that John is going to record for us what's going on with 31 verses, not 10 and not 11, 31 verses in John. John does not specifically mention the bread and the wine at the first sitting of the supper table. He begins when the Last Supper event has ended. It was the supper where the unleavened bread and the wine emblems were given to the disciples. And I want you to take note that only John records the foot washing. Nobody else does. I find that very interesting. And like in part 1, we found that John had a lot of extra details that the Synoptic Gospels did not have. So let's look and see what John has to say. Verse 1, now before the feast of the Passover, when Yahushua knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. So I have a note there for verse 2. Judas is specifically mentioned at the very beginning of this account when the Last Supper event was ended. You need to take note of that. Verse 3, Yahushua, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from Elohim and went to Elohim, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments, and he took a towel and he girded himself. So right here in verse 4, Yahushua rises from the supper table to wash all the disciples' feet. Remember, Judas is there. Verse 5, after that, he poureth water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Remember, Yahushua is going to be washing the feet of all 12 disciples. Let's continue on in verse 6. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Master, dost thou wash my feet? And Yahushua answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. And Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. And Yahushua answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And Simon Peter saith unto him, Master, not my feet only, also my hands and my head. And then Yahushua says to Peter, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but he is clean every whit. And you are clean, but not all. So right here in verse 10, we are finding our first clue that there is a betrayer in the group when we come to John. First clue that there's a betrayer in the group. Let's keep reading. For he who knew who should betray him, therefore said he, Ye are not all clean. Yahushua was talking about Judas. Another clue of the betrayer there. Verse 12, so after he had washed their feet and had taken his own garments, he was set down again, and he said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? So verse 12, a comment, this is the second time that Yahushua is at the table. Did you see? He went back and he sat down. And this is very likely a round table, according to how the following events are going to be recorded. So just notice what happens. Verse 13, you call me teacher and master, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your teacher and master, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. So right there, he's giving instructions for the ordinance of foot washing. Verse 15, for I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. So he's saying, okay, this is something else that we're going to implement. We've implemented the bread and the wine emblems, and now the foot washing. Verse 16, verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He, and he's talking about Judas, he that eateth bread, that was that Artos bread at that first supper, He that eateth bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. Okay, don't forget that the eating of this bread that he's talking about was at that first supper table. And in verse 18, we have a second clue that there is a betrayer in the group. How many more clues are we going to get from John? Verse 19. Now I tell you before it come, that when it is come to pass, you may believe that I am he. Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. But there's more verses. Verse 21. When Yahushua had said thus, he was troubled in spirit, and he testified, and he said, Verily, verily, I say unto you that one of you shall betray me. Look at everyone in verse 21. That is your third clue that there is a betrayer in the group. John's going to make sure that you know there is a betrayer here. Verse 22. Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. And my comments are, no other gospel writer reports that the disciples did not know who the betrayer was. Let's see what happens. Verse 23. Now there was leaning on Yahushua's bosom one of his disciples. I'm going to tell you it was John, whom Yahushua loved. All through the book of John, John talks about himself as the one that Yahushua just kept on loving. So John's position is given where he is at with Yahushua. Now look what happens in verse 24. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him. He beckoned to John. Peter and John were very, very close. Peter beckoned to John that he should ask who it should be of whom he's speaking about. So Peter is urging John to find out who is the betrayer. Since he's the closest in position, Peter must have been across from the table to make eye contact with John. I'm pretty sure they were not sitting in a straight line. Verse 25, he, talking about John, then lying on Yahushua's breast, saith unto him, Master, who is it? And I just want you to just picture this scene. John just is so close to Yahushua, his master. He's getting just as close as he can. He's got his head lying on his breast, his shoulder. And you know what? John silently asks the question, as is going to be noted very shortly. You can imagine that his lips were very, very close to the ears of Yahushua. I'll read verse 25 again. John, then laying on Yahushua's breast, saith unto him, Master, who is it? Or do you think he said, Master, who is it? Or do you think he said, Master, who is it? Verse 26, Yahushua answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. You know, in verse 26, Yahushua answers John quietly to not expose the betrayer by name. The dipped sop is involved, and Judas must have been sitting on the other side of Yahushua. That's the only way that this is going to work. Verse 27, after the sop, Satan entered into him, and then said Yahushua unto him, Thou shalt that thou doest do quickly. Fourth clue that there is a betrayer in the group, everyone. And now verse 28, extremely important verse. Look what it says. Only John reports this. Now, no man at the table knew for what intent he spake this unto Judas. John is the only one that records that no one of the other disciples, not one, know why Judas leaves. And in verse 29, here's the clue. For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Yahushua had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. So in verse 29, Yahushua still does not expose Judas for who he really is. but all he does is say to act quickly. But look at what else is in verse 29. Buy those things that we have need of against the feast. So it was not the feast of Passover yet, and it definitely was not the festival of unleavened bread. Okay, very interesting. Verse 30, he then having received the sop went immediately out, and it was night. Fifth clue that there is a betrayer in the group when Judas leaves. And verse 31, we're going to finish up here with John. Therefore, when he was gone out, Yahushua said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and Elohim is glorified in him. So what we want to do now is take our study back to the bread. We have a little bit of homework to do in Luke 22:19 for this word bread as artos. Tim, will you help us out here?
And he took bread, that's artos, and gave thanks, and brake it, and gave unto them, saying, this is my body. There are several issues that should be taken note of right here. The definition of the Greek word artos does not indicate only leavened bread, but because we already know this word is also used for unleavened bread. There is a Greek word that could have been used for unleavened bread, that is G106, azumos. However, the translators did not make this choice. Part 1 of this study determined that the Last Supper was the day before the Passover festival. At this point in time, everyone is still allowed to eat leavened bread if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
Luke 22:19, bread is artos. However, that being said, the Jews that were preparing for the Passover festival by arriving 6 days early likely still had a good supply of leavened products in their dwelling places on Abib 13, including unleavened bread, cakes, and wafers that would have been prepared or purchased for the spring festival. A study on leaven most often represents the leaven of sin. However, leaven can also represent leaven for the kingdom of heaven. And we can see that in Matthew 13, verse 33. Mm-hmm. Not all are clean.
And just like we looked at in part 1 about getting the leaven out of the house or the upper room or whatever, they had all day to do it. So there was no reason why they couldn't have unleavened bread at that Last Supper table. Absolutely no reason whatsoever. So that's an important thing to remember. But no, not all of them were clean. There were 2 groups of people after that foot washing. Most were in a clean condition, or you could say unleavened, and one was in a filthy condition, and I would say leavened with sin. In John 13, verses 10 and 11, Yahushua said to him, he that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but he is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. That's from the King James. And even though all 12 disciples had their feet washed by Yahushua, the betrayer was still leavened by sin, even though he had taken the cup and he had actually eaten the unleavened bread. But you know what? We just keep finding John will be different. John's account of the Last Supper is quite a bit different than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In John's account of the Last Supper, there is only one verse that uses this word bread, artos, G740. It's in John 13:18. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth artos bread with me has lifted up his heel against me. There is absolutely no written account that Yahushua ate or drank anything that evening. However, one of the disciples that was with him accepted this bread and ate it. And we're going to have more documentation coming on that pretty quick. It's really interesting that John has not given a detailed account of the actual bread that Yahushua gave to all of the disciples. In verse 18, He mentions the bread at the first supper table in connection with that betrayer. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention the bread that was given to the betrayer. However, all three of them mention the bread that was eaten in remembrance of their master. So we're just going to take time here on the next 3 slides to do some remembering and some comparing. And I'd like Tim to go through these with us because there's some important things we just want to pull together.
Time to remember. The Greek word artos attempts to describe the unleavened bread of the Torah. In the Synoptic Gospels, it appears artos is used to describe Yahusha's body, which was given broken for us, which we know was without sin, and it was without leaven. Note, just because it appears the Synoptic Gospels are talking about leavened bread, do we dare question if this is really bread with leaven? Are we allowed to question that, or is that off the table? Gospel comparisons. Matthew, Mark, and Luke write about Yahusha sitting at the supper table just one time. Yet, John records sitting at the supper table 2 distinct times. Number 2, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not record the foot washing ceremony. Yet, John records that Yahusha washes all the disciples' feet, and that includes Judas. Number 3, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Yahusha gives only one clue of who the betrayer is. Yet in John, there is 5 clues given of the betrayer. John identifies it quite clearly. Gospel comparisons continued. Number 4, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record bread being broken at the supper table. None of them record the sop being dipped. However, in John, John does not record bread being broken at the first supper table, but he does mention the betrayer ate bread at his presence at the first supper table. John does talk about the sop being dipped with the betrayer at the second sitting of the supper table after the foot washing ceremony. Number 5, Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to indicate that all the disciples knew that Judas was the betrayer. John makes it clear that Yahusha did not expose or embarrass Judas to the whole group, but rather gave Judas every opportunity to confess and repent of his planned deed. Yet we know he did not confess or repent.
I hope you're enjoying these interesting looks at John. We just have a little closer look at John, and then I'll have Tim do a semi-final conclusion on the next slide. I want to consider the details in John just a little more closely and see if there is another option to this controversy over the bread. In John 13, verse 26, Yahusha answered, "He it is to whom I shall give a sop." It's 55:96. "I shall give a sop when I have dipped," it's 9:11, "when I have dipped it. And when he dipped," that's now 1686, "when he dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon." So we've got some different word numbers here. Sop is somian, a diminutive form or derivative of the base of 5597, and we already talked about this, a crumb or a morsel, as if it was rubbed off, like just a mouthful. That's all it is. It's just a little bite. The very first word dipped that is used is 911, bapto. It means to overwhelm, to cover wholly with a fluid. In the New Testament, look what it says, only in a qualified or specially sense, means to moisten, okay, by implication, to stain as with a dye, something like that. 911 is bapto, but we also have dipped as 1686, and this is bapto. And you know what this means? To whelm on, to wet. In other words, to dip long enough for the item to be soaking wet and not just moistened. It's going to be soaking wet. It's dipped, and it's dipped really good. So Tim, give us some of these final semi-final conclusions, and then we'll go on a little bit more with John.
Number one, in part one of this study, we found this Last Supper did indeed take place on Abib 13. Number two, the disciples were asked to prepare for the Passover. Point number three, they would have purchased some unleavened bread for the Passover meal they were planning to eat on Abib 14. Number four, the local homes could still be cleaned of leaven on Abib 14 before the Passover meal in the evening. Number five, there was no command to rid unleavened products on Abib 13. Number six, therefore, having leavened bread at the table that was used by Yahusha to dip the sop for Judas was not an issue. However, Yahusha would not and did not use leavened bread to represent his body at the first sitting of this table. Number eight, according to the definition for the sop that was dipped, it would have been a leavened morsel of bread that soaked up a lot of the dip. Only Judas received this sop, indicating he was totally leavened with sin.
And, you know, I just always sort of find that John has the final word. We need to remember that his gospel was written around 90 to 100 AD. This was long after the Synoptic Gospels. And John's focus was to take the message of the Messiah to the Gentile world, and they were all under Roman rule. His work would have been definitely translated into Greek, as the majority, if not all, of the Gentile world, they did not read Hebrew. Even a lot of the Jews were not reading Hebrew anymore at that time. Now, he knew about this Koine Greek, and he probably knew that it was being used to translate the Hebrew. And he probably also knew that it didn't often supply the word or the terms for full and proper understanding. We've gotten into a little bit of a mix-up with the Synoptic Gospels just looking at part one. So it's very evident through the use of artos that defines both leavened and unleavened bread. John would have known that there is a problem here. And while this seems like just a little tiny small detail, there's big differences in the meanings. So you know what? John is really careful in his record of how he uses this word bread or artos. I think that by the time he compiled his gospel, he must have realized that the problem was in the synoptic writings. John uses terminology for the Last Supper that removes every trace of linking leavened artos bread to his master Yahusha. He is not going to take any chances. He's the only one that records that not one of the rest of the disciples knew exactly who the betrayer was except himself. And you know, I just feel like that's such a sweet way of Yahusha to just gently give every opportunity to the erring one that they could have repentance. And should that not happen, he would not deliberately expose them or embarrass the individual to a whole host of others. He's just so gracious about that. So yes, 2 supper tables, just coming up to a summary here. The Synoptic Gospels all record that first supper table about the emblems of the bread and the grape juice, the wine. And then there's that foot washing service that seems to connect these 2 separate supper tables. And this is where John's account comes in. He picks up the story with the second sitting at the supper table, and then of course that sop. At the first supper table, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke recording that there was breaking of artos bread. There was receiving the wine. One has a mention of a betrayer in the group. There's an appearance that all know who the betrayer is. And there's no mention of leaving the supper table for the foot washing. And remember, each one of them uses about 10 or 11 verses to record these events about this first supper table. But when we get to this second sitting at the supper table, and we start looking at John 13, he's using 31 verses to record the events at this Second Supper table. He's not going to leave out anything. His record is different. He records the event is before the Passover. He makes sure that you know that no way out. This is definitely before the Passover. He only records the First Supper of emblems is ended. There is no mention about the breaking of the bread or the receiving of the juice or the wine. And he mentions Judas specifically when the First Supper is ended. And only John records the foot washing after that First Supper with the emblems. And then John records that Yahusha sat at the supper table again. He is showing you that this is the second time that Yahusha is coming back to the table. Number 6, John is the one that has 5 statements declaring that there is a betrayer in the group. Number 7, nobody knows who the betrayer is except John. Number 8, the disciples felt that Judas had special regard, as it was only him that received that dip sop. Remember, that was of high regard. The disciples all thought, Judas is high on the list here, right? And he was sitting beside Yahusha. Number 9, the only time that John uses the term artos, leavened bread, is after the foot washing at the Second Supper table. And number 10, this artos leavened sop was thoroughly dipped and it was given to only Judas. And number 11, only John records that Judas removed himself from the group, leaving 11. And I don't want you to forget number 12. Remember, most of them thought that Judas was leaving to prepare something for the feast that was still to come. So the feast of Passover had not arrived, and neither had the festival of unleavened bread. So why is John's gospel so different? I just want to tell you, I'm thankful that it is. The following are just some thoughts and questions for further consideration around this controversial bread in the study on the Last Supper. This is a fact. The Synoptic Gospels and the book of Acts were written well in advance of John, varying from 40 to 69 AD. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were trying to reach the unconverted Jews with the gospel of the true Messiah. And we all know that Paul was chosen. He was the chosen one to take the gospel of the true Messiah to the Gentiles. Another fact, John's gospel was written between 90 to 100 AD. That's about 20 to 50 years later. And of the disciples and the apostles, John was the longest living eyewitness. And by the time he wrote his gospel, he was focusing on the Roman and Gentile community. We know this as he used Roman reckoning of time for that passion account. And obviously, he was determined that his true Messiah was not to be confused with any other counterfeit Messiah. There was no way. But could it be? Here's another question. Could it be? I want you to think outside the box. John deliberately did not write about the events at the First Supper table because of that coiny Greek word artos. He knew that that could not properly describe the unleavened bread that Yahusha used at the first seating of the supper table. And I'm going to ask the question, why? Artos is first understood as leavened bread by the definition of the Greek Roman mindset. He was not going to take any chances. Artos, leavened bread, does not rightly represent the flesh of John's perfect and true Messiah. Azumos, yes, it is the best word to absolutely verify bread, would be the unleavened type, but likely not the best word for the Greeks to understand the whole concept, as this was not a common word. So could it be that these are some of the reasons that John deliberately chose to avoid recording the events around the unleavened bread and wine? And the reason that I say this is because he knew what was in the Synoptic Gospels. This was their witness. It was their account. and he couldn't change one word of it. So he had to do something in his gospel to set the record straight. So I think, you know, John must have pored over those gospels trying to figure out how to get this problem solved. Anyway, we're finished with the second witness of John's book, and we're ready to go into the third witness for this Artos bread study, and it's the patterns of type and antitype as we finish up here. For some of you that might not understand these terms, type and antitype, basically type is what you'll find in the Old Testament, and it's a shadow of the true, and the antitype is the final true fulfillment that you're going to find in Yahushua's life as he fulfills the type. And we'll do some of that work here in a little bit. But just a little bit of work here on leavened bread conflicts. Tim, can you help us out with this slide?
There are some that feel leavened bread could also represent Yahushua's body, as the wine represents his blood. Yahushua said we are to partake of the bread as a representation of his body, and the wine as a representation of his blood. Some feel the bread can or must be leavened because the Greek word artos is defined as leavened bread. Does that mean the wine can also be leavened? Or is one leavened and one unleavened? Matthew's Hebrew translation used the word lechem for bread. In Hebrew, this lechem can also have dual definitions. Is this likely the reason the Greek translation used artos rather than adzumos? In this study, we have discovered that both lechem and artos easily can take on both meanings of either leavened or unleavened. How is it that this conflict can be settled?
Well, we want to look at some patterns, type and antitype, just one slide. And the question is, would not the type and the antitype have the last word on the final answer to this bread controversy? So let's just dig a little deeper to find how the type must link to the antitype for complete fulfillment in Yahushua, the true Messiah. And we're just going to use a few examples. There's lots of them throughout the scriptures. But remember, type is just a shadow. It's just a shadow representing something that's true. So when we look at lamb as the Passover sacrifice, accompanied by that lamb sacrifice has to have a grain offering. So on the antitype side, Yahushua is going to be the antitype. He is the one that represents the true Passover lamb, the one that actually gives the final sacrifice. And like I said, the shadow, the type, also has a grain offering. Well, what does Yahushua say? Bread is the grain offering. And he was saying, for example, that's my body. In the shadow, a drink offering, a type, the shadow is also a drink offering. And what does Yahushua do? He says, the wine is the drink offering. That's going to represent my blood. Now, we know that the sacrifices were always accompanied with a grain offering and a drink offering, and this was always on the altar of burnt offerings. Well, when we look at Yahushua and the antitype, this is what we find. His pierced and striped flesh represents that grain offering, and the matzah bread definitely has all those stripes and marks on it, doesn't it? And his spilled blood represents his drink offering. And what was Yahushua's steak? That was his altar of burnt offering. So he fulfills the antitype. He gives you the true meaning of everything that was happening as the type or the shadow. But we need to look at Exodus 34:25. This is from the book of the law, and there are some instructions for the leaven. Tim, will you help us out with this?
Sure. So let's note here in Exodus 32, the people had just violated the covenant with the golden calf offense. Exodus 34:25 is a very short, stern reminder after Moshe's last trip down Mount Sinai of what not to do regarding leaven. Idol worship links to paganism and sin. So does offering leaven with blood sacrifices. Therefore, this command was given before the sanctuary was set up. Verse 25, Ye shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of Passover be left until morning. This command is for all blood sacrifices on any altar, not just the altar of burnt offerings. And we're going to get some more details in Leviticus 2 from the book of the law on this topic. Scriptural requirements for grain offerings, Leviticus 2. When anyone offers a grain offering to Yahuwah, his offering shall be of fine flour. Please note that fine flour, that is wheat. That is not barley. As we mentioned before, wheat is fine flour, and that is the best for our Savior. Starting again. When anyone offers a grain offering to Yahuwah, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it. And salt is also a requirement. He shall bring it to Aharon's sons, the priests, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to Yahuwah. It is most holy of the offerings to Yahuwah made by fire. And for baking in an oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil. And for baking in a pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil. The unleavened grain offering is a type to be fulfilled in Messiah. More requirements for grain offerings. Number 6, you shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. Number 7, baked in a covered pan. You shall bring the grain offering to the priest. He shall bring it to the altar. Number 9, then the priest shall take from the grain offering a memorial portion and burn it on the altar. 10, and what is left of the grain offering shall be Aharon's and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to Yahuwah made by fire. The unleavened grain offering is offered with the blood sacrifice. Scriptural requirements for grain offerings, Leviticus 2, verse 11. Note this. No grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven. Say that again. No grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven nor any honey in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. These detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. However, they were first given in the book of the covenant. So let's examine Exodus 23, verse 18.
Yes, Exodus 23:18, that's in the book of the covenant, and it has some instructions for leaven as well. Here we go. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. Is very, very clear. But we just want to look at a little bit about the law of the peace offerings in Leviticus 7:11-14. Now, this was also known as a thanksgiving offering, a heave offering, or a peace offering. It had a lot of different names. And this is what it says in Leviticus 7:11-14. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he shall offer to Yahuwah. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, or cakes of blended flour mixture with oil. Notice all those qualifiers. Besides the cakes as his offering, he shall offer leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offering. And from it he shall offer one cake from each offering as a heave offering to Yahuwah. It shall belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering. And that's from the New King James Version. Now here, the leavened bread offering belonged to the priest. That is something to kind of take note of. But you know, these peace offerings are very unique. This sacrifice could be offered in times of thankfulness, times of peace, joy, a promise or a vow, for health, safety, for redemption, you know, just about anything you wanted, you know, if you just wanted to get together. And a portion of this sacrifice was given to the priest along with several varieties of unleavened bread and cakes. And the rest of the offering was for the offerer, it was for his family, his neighbors, his guests, and for the poor. And it was to be eaten within 2 days, enjoying the feast and the fellowship. Nothing was to be lacking. And anything that was left over beyond the specified time, the instruction was that it had to be burnt. Being eaten meant that the majority of this sacrifice was not offered upon the altar. However, besides the unleavened requirements, the offer was also to bring leavened bread, which is peculiar to only this offering, but never was this leavened bread offered upon the altar, for that was already forbidden in Leviticus, probably not Luke, Leviticus 2:11. Remember, we read about that. The leavened bread was to be eaten with the flesh of the sacrifice, so that the meal would be most pleasant for everyone. And what's the reason for that? Well, most people like leavened bread more than the unleavened. It's more desirable. Let's just put it that way. So Tim, tell us what this strict requirement is again for these grain offerings.
Strict requirement for the grain offerings on the altar of burnt offering. Let's be sure that we realize the leaven requirement attached to the peace offering is unique, and that this leaven was never offered on the altar of burnt offering, according to Leviticus 2, verse 11. No grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey, in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. These detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. However, they were first given in the book of the covenant.
And we're just going to do a review of that, and then we're going to close up. Exodus 23:18.
Book of the Covenant instructions for leaven, Exodus 23:18. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until morning. Let us never assume that Yahushua would ever describe his flesh as being likened to leavened bread.
Okay, I think we're ready for some final conclusions as we wrap this up. Leavened bread should never be used when celebrating the ordinances of the Last Supper. 3 witnesses testified to this in Luke 24:30 in that Emmaus account. The bread in this verse was definitely unleavened, despite the fact that the Greek term artos was used, and it seems to represent leavened bread. Remember, we said context was king. In John 13:18, the bread in this verse used the Greek term artos as well, but this is correct this time, as the context is in connection with the artos sop that was given to the leavened Judas. And then number 3 are patterns of type and antitype from both the Book of the Covenant and the Book of the Law. There are explicit instructions that no leaven is ever to be placed on the altar with the blood sacrifice that would mar the identity of our true Messiah. Everyone, choose you this day who your Messiah is, and choose the ordinances that he has set out for us to observe. Well, that's the end of part 2. I hope you've enjoyed this from Luke and John and the type and the antitype and all the patterns. And we just want to say that if you have any questions and comments, you can send those to questions@studythecalendar.com, and all the studies are free to download at any time at studythecalendar.com. We hope that you enjoy the studies there. We just want to thank you for being with us tonight, and shalom.